Looks like
It says we're live.
It says we're live. We're going to verify we're going live here for Talking Real Book Club.
Woohoo.
Let's see here. Gonna do a little verification, give people a few minutes to join us here live on Talking Real. Should put the little question up there, the little thing up for
awesome.
Live on LinkedIn, live on Facebook, it looks like. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes. Try to give people a few minutes to join in as we get started here for Talking Real Book Club.
Yeah.
It's been a while since we've done a Facebook Live on Talking Real, and I'm excited to be back here doing this again. We've tried to get a nice little our little talk show set up here. It should be good.
I kind of like this.
Yeah.
This should be an everyday podcast setup.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So hopefully we'll get a few people joined in here. Man, we hope today too that as you join in, that you engage with us in this conversation to leave your comments, and we'll talk to folks. We'll answer your questions, put your thoughts out there on the stream as well.
Yeah.
So make sure you're engaging with us. So start thinking now, what questions do you have? Go ahead and start getting those in the comments. What thoughts do you have as we get started and get rolling? Because we're going to be talking about all that kind of stuff today here on Talking Real Live.
That's right. And you know how we like putting Jeff on the spot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's my favorite thing. I love to be put on the spot. It's a good time. People do it to me all the time and wouldn't want it any other way. So, but yeah, this is going to be episode, I don't remember what episode this is.
204, I believe.
We think episode 204 of Talking Real. So obviously we've been at it for a long time, and appreciate those that are joining us that have been on our live streams before, that have listened from episode 1, or maybe this will be your first episode, but we appreciate you. 203, episode 203.
We're ahead.
Yeah. So, and as we get started today, let me ask you, as we always do for 203 episodes now, how's your day?
My day is great. Really excited about this. We planned this a couple months ago, and yeah, a book club, a book review on, not a review, but a book club on Talking Real. This is gonna be good. How's your day?
My day's fantastic, man. I like you said, I'm excited. We love doing these kinds of things. We love podcasting. We love that people engage with us and listen, because I mean, what else do you want to do but have podcasting as part of your work? I mean, and you know me, Nabil, you give me a captive audience and a microphone and a camera, and I am all about it. So I'm thrilled.
The GRI crowd knows all about that.
Absolutely. So looking forward to see, hopefully some of our GRI folks will tune in here, but I'll be seeing them this week, tomorrow, to do a little GRI teaching. But let's just go ahead and get on into this. And as people join in, hopefully they'll leave some comments and chat with us and give us some feedback. So, what we talked about, we're discussing today The Color of Law, and we've been reading this over the month of April, because April was Fair Housing Month, and we thought, this has been on my to read list for a long time. And this was like a good reason to finally just jump in and, hey, let's do a book club with it. We did a little book club session as staff. And so, we're now having the opportunity to do it on the stream here for all of our Talking Real fans. And we see Jessica Thompson's joined us, left a little clappy hands there. Jessica, we're so glad to join you. I saw Jessica out this last week in Washington, D.C. for mid-year, and we talked about this and some other books. So get your recommendations ready at the end, Jessica, because we are going to ask for what should our next book be. We'll talk about that at the end, but we're going to get started here and get into The Color of Law.
Yeah, let's do it.
Are you ready, Nabil?
Sure.
To be fair, we have actually read the book, so we're gonna have some discussions here. Obviously, we can't talk about everything, but this was a really interesting book to me. And so, I want to start out, Nabil, and I want to ask you first, like, what surprised you as you read The Color of Law? And kind of the question there is, did you know about this? Like, did you know about some of the history of sort of the legal frameworks and restrictions that the governments were putting in place to segregate housing in America? And for those, of course, that have been listening, Nabil, you moved to the United States when you were 16.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, I'm curious, especially from your perspective, did you know about this? Was this a surprise to you? Like what was kind of a surprise to you in the book?
So the surprising part of the book was, at least to me, how recent it seemed. And like you said, since I moved here when I was 16, I didn't know much about history. I was also not very into history,
Sure.
as you know, and law. But like just going through that, and obviously working at the association, I've heard and learned about some of the practices like redlining and things like that. So I was aware of it, but the detail and the time frame and how it was carried out was very like eye-opening and surprising.
Yeah. I agree with your comment on it being more recent than you think about, because I think we're so disconnected, and especially, you know, I was not born when most of this was going on. Now, no, maybe early at some of the very tail end of some of the different restrictions, but when you look at it and you're thinking, oh, this was a long time ago. This is a long time ago. Well, the 40s, the 50s. I mean, you know, a lot of these things, when we're at some of the peak of this going on, was really not that long ago, right? When you're talking about the Fair Housing Act being adopted in the 60s, when we're talking about cases, and we'll talk about one of these cases pretty soon, about the enforcement of restrictive covenants being in the 50s when that was outlawed. You're absolutely right. I mean, this is a time period when maybe I was not alive when those kinds of things are going on, but my parents were, my grandparents definitely were, and they were old enough to like know what was going on, right? So yeah, this is not like generations removed necessarily. This is definitely a recent thing. And of course, as we get started here, we've welcomed a couple of the people. I see a couple of comments coming here. Lydia Hedrick has joined us as well. Good to see you. So you haven't read the book, but looking forward to the discussion. That's great. I mean, this is for everybody, and hope that this will maybe inspire you to go pick up that book and read it. And of course, Kathy Perez Whiteside, a former guest on Talking Real, who honestly was one of my favorite episodes, was our discussion with Kathy. So I'm so glad to see
that was a great episode.
Well. And certainly on points, kind of what we're talking about here, I think is relevant. You know, the other surprises to me, I think, and I knew that, like, this filled in a lot of gaps, I guess is what I would say, is that I knew there was a lot of, you know, legal restrictions to home ownership and just segregation in general, whether that was in education, whether that was in, you know, public transportation, public accommodations, all these various places where segregation was so ingrained legally into our society. But I think the thing that surprised me is how this did fill in the gaps about, these weren't just like federal restrictions, and nor were they just state restrictions, but they were down to every municipality. I mean, this was so broad and so pervasive that even when we started to see some of the pullback from, you know, the Supreme Court overruling some of these restrictions and limitations and the segregation policies, there was still so much of it going on at the state level, at the local level. And we've even got a point on just in Oklahoma, how that went specifically. And so that, I think, is what was interesting to me, was there's just so many dominoes you have to knock down to get this going, right? It wasn't just, oh, well, the Supreme Court said we can't do this anymore, so look, it's fixed, right? We've done it. You know, it's not like that at all. And so there was a lot of different ways where you would have maybe a win at the Supreme Court, but then you would have, you know, people trying to figure out, okay, well, how can we get around that? Right. How can we take that and get around it a little bit? So Jessica's chiming in here. She said it definitely made her want to ask her family members what role they played in all of this. It actually says hold them accountable for their personal decisions they make. And basically for her to be an advocate for fair housing as well. And I certainly think that being an advocate for fair housing, as realtors especially, is extraordinarily important. And I do think it's interesting to figure out what is your family history and figure out what was going on. And that's, you know, as we talk about this, you know, one of the things that we were looking at as sort of different discussion topics and so forth was that a lot of things, you know, you expect to understand two sides to a story and understand that we're getting, you know, information that's presented from the author of this book? And was there anything missing, or what sort of things would be interesting to hear from other perspectives? And I think Jessica kind of raises that issue a little bit here of understanding what other people who were involved or witnessing these things at the time, what was their perspective? How have they changed their perspective over time today, and those kinds of things? I think that'd be really interesting because, what is that history, and what did people think at that time?
Yeah. And later in the book, there was an interesting point, especially if whoever's read the book, there's this really nice section of frequently asked questions that kind of asks things similar to along this line. So one of them was, this happened so far, so not so long ago, but still not in our generation, so why are we going back and holding people accountable? Is this should we do this, or should we just move on, kind of thing? And he said a good point, being like, hey, we hold people accountable for all the good things that have happened as well, right? So this is like, as an American, you buy into the history, you buy into everything that's done, so it is like our history.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and on that part about being an advocate, I think this is important for realtors to understand, because I think we have to recognize sort of where we were as an organization. And this is not to like beat ourselves up over anything, but it's, again, we have to understand our history in order to not repeat it. And also just to understand that, like, when we are enacting laws, we're advocating for different things, to understand what the implications of those are, and knowing the history and how things were perhaps twisted, or ways that people used what maybe on its face looked fine, but had, the implication was that there were going to be these racial restrictions. And so I do want to kind of start out and point out that as a realtor organization, we are now huge advocates for fair housing, and are taking significant steps to promote that and advocate for it. And there's a lot of work to be done there, but there was a time when we weren't, right? We were a big opponent of fair housing. And in fact, in our code of ethics, I think this is just interesting to read exactly what it said. And so I'm going to read this to you real quick, but that it was in, I think 1926, maybe, that we adopted as part of our code of ethics. I'm sorry, it was 1924, that our code of ethics stated that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood, right? And so we actually had in our code of ethics for quite some time this restriction that said, as realtors, we're not going to introduce somebody who's Black into a white neighborhood. And now that's not government restriction, but it does kind of illustrate the sort of in tandem government restrictions that we're going to discuss here in just a second, with also what was going on in sort of the private industry. Right. So those of us that were, leading into, trying to introduce people to houses, sell them houses, those kinds of things, we had it literally a part of our code of ethics to say that we're not going to introduce somebody of a particular race or nationality that's different from, what that current neighborhood is. So if you're Black, you got to go to a Black neighborhood. If you're white, you can go to a white neighborhood, and we're not going to mix those. That was really part of our code of ethics. Right.
And obviously we weren't there when that was done. So, you could even look at it like, at that point, they were protecting the industry to protect housing values and membership and everything like that. So like, it's interesting seeing things, almost 100 years later, because their perspective and their intention might have been something different.
Absolutely. And that's where, when you look at it, it discusses that it's detrimental to property values. And of course, that was the implication. But also, I mean, at that time, people probably did think that was the reality, right? Like that it probably did bear out that way, that if you introduce somebody and all of a sudden it's like, oh, this is this white neighborhood, but now we've got, we've let Black people move in, property values, people don't want to pay to live there anymore. Right. So the way that worked out is it probably did work out in reality that way, but to say that we're going to propagate that, we're going to continue that, we're going to, and this idea that, oh, well, somebody's race implicates how much that house is going to be worth. Right. And one of the things the book really points to is this idea of de jure versus de facto segregation. And when we say de facto segregation, the idea there is that just people decided to be segregated.
It just happens.
It just happens that people, their natural their natural thing they'll do is to segregate and be with people that look like them or whatever. And the point this book is making, because that's really a modern day thought in a lot of ways, is that people are like, well, it just happens, right? It's just the way that it was. People chose to do that. And yeah, there may have been some influence from, policies and things, but really it was de facto. It just happened. And the point this book is making is like, no, there was significant regulation, restrictions, policies in place at the governmental level that created that segregation. That is de jure segregation, where it's actually governmental mandated, imposed segregation.
Right.
So, and the way that worked out, I think one of the subjects we wanted to talk about today, because obviously we can't talk about absolutely everything, but was really sort of the FHA and VA restrictions that were going on, was an area that I found really interesting in how deep that went and how pervasive it was. Because
there was no gray area.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Because it's one thing to say, well, we've got a VA or an FHA appraiser that's going to say, we think that this house is going to be worth less because of the person that's buying or to the people in the neighborhood. But it wasn't just that. It was, we had actual policies in place. For example, the underwriting policies specifically addressed that, race was a factor, right? The race was a factor. And on top of that, what I found very fascinating was that one of the areas that gets talked about a lot is Levittown. And something that a lot of people are familiar with. And this was in the post-World War II era, right? We had a housing problem. People were coming back from the war. They didn't have places to live. And so there was this huge push to build new houses and expand housing.
Right.
And this is where the government came into play, right? Because they were financing this building, right? So Levittown was going to be something like 17,500 homes, huge development.
Right.
And it was funded by the government. I mean, the builder there was saying that we could not do this, but for the fact that the government was funding it.
It kind of had, something that big.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so the FHA basically guaranteed nearly the full cost of the proposed subdivisions. And even by 1948, most housing nationwide was being constructed with FHA and VA funding, right? So almost everything is being developed. And you've got the FHA saying, we're going to fund this 17,500 development of Levittown. But here's the thing. You can only sell the houses to white people. I mean, that's
literally what it said.
That's literally what it said. When you look at exactly what had to go in there, because that's in here, and I'll read that to you as well, because I think it's interesting to see exactly what was quoted. This actually came from not Levittown, but this was a St. Louis development, the St. Anne suburb, but very similar, same thing, being funded by FHA. And they had to, in their deeds, state specifically, and I quote, "No lot or portion of a lot or building erected thereon shall be sold, leased, rented, or occupied by any other than those of the Caucasian race." So you've got all this housing being built. We're going to support people coming back from the war. We're going to give them government financing. We're going to not just build it, but then we're going to insure those mortgages. They're going to get great rates on their mortgages. And that was only available to white people. I mean, you had to be white or Caucasian to take advantage of it.
Right. Even though others served in the war and made the same sacrifice.
Yeah. And so when we start talking about that de facto versus de jure, this wasn't just like, oh, the VA appraiser came out and said, oh, no, this individual person's not qualified because of their race. I mean, we're talking about thousands of other locales, government financing to build them. And what are we having? Or we're literally having restrictions. I'm curious if anybody listening, I'd be interested to know, like, have you seen maybe like an abstract in Oklahoma where there's an old deed that has something like that? Because, we knew that was going on here. I mean, it was going on everywhere. So I'd really be curious if anybody's ever specifically seen one, put your eyes on one from an abstract or something like that here in Oklahoma. But, that was kind of what we were seeing there, right? We've got a federal policy that's building virtually all housing in the United States in the late 40s, early 50s. And so that's what you have. And actually Jessica says here that hers says that from 1925. So she's got a 1925 deed that specifically says that. And that came up this last week at mid-year, there was some discussion about trying to go back and how can we remove those. And actually somebody chimed in and said, that's great if you want to like remove those restrictions, but we also need to be documenting that. It'd be, we need to not lose sight of that history of, we need to document where were these things done, what neighborhoods and locales and areas. And Kathy, what does she say here, Nabil?
Kathy says, yes, I live in the Waverly historic area, and it says that no one of color could live in the neighborhood. Yeah. And her house was built in 1906.
Yeah. So, I suspect that a lot of people would end up seeing that kind of thing as well. And so, it's just interesting to think back. And again, 1920, so 100 years ago, her house was built 100, not quite 120, 115 years ago. Right. So, yeah, like she says, it was shocking when you read that. And it is, right? You think about kind of how that plays, and it's, and thinking to yourself, right? In that case, right, it says that no person of color, and here you are, right? Maybe a person of color, like how?
Right? Yeah,
it's challenging, right? But so here's what ended up happening, right? So eventually, let's fast forward and say, okay, well, now the government's maybe starting to look and say, we're looking at things that. Okay, what do we have? We've got these restrictive covenants, and we get around to Shelley versus Kramer, and this was a case I wanted to kind of bring up, that the Supreme Court finally took a look at this and said, because what was happening is you've got these restrictive covenants, right? You've got a deed that says, like, you got to be white to live here. Somebody says, we're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna sell to somebody who's black. And what was happening is you would have people, the neighbors, go to court and have these people evicted, right? They would basically undo the sale. I mean, they would say, you can't live here. They would enforce that. And so what happened with Shelley versus Kramer is that the Supreme Court, and this was in 1948, it was a ruling that said that courts cannot evict people to enforce a restrictive covenant. That basically the issue was, they're finally going to say, look, courts, this is illegal. We can't enforce that. As a government, we're starting to finally take these steps to say, government, you can't enforce segregated housing by evicting people, right? But what ended up happening was a lot of the states sort of found a way to get around it. And this is what we were talking about, right, where there's always a little way around it, that everybody found the gaps that they could work in.
Always a loophole?
Yeah, always a little loophole that they're going to narrow. So they say, okay, well, courts, you can't enforce that. You can't go in and evict somebody. That we're not going to be a part of that. That's illegal. Can't do that anymore. But then you had Oklahoma, right? And this is what happened in a lot of other states. We actually took this pretty far. And so while they said that, Oklahoma Supreme Court said, while we can't evict somebody, what you can do is a neighbor could sue both the seller and the purchaser for engaging in a conspiracy to diminish a community's property values. So this is what the next phase was, right? We're not going to kick the people out of the neighborhood, but we're going to let the neighbors come in and we're going to sue you for damages. And this is specifically what that court opinion said.
What year was this again?
So 1948 is when Shelley v. Kramer was. I'm actually not sure what year
that particular,
but most of this started happening in like about the 5 years following is when we were still dealing with these issues. So it was
because like that argument read similar to what the board had put out, right? The diminishing property values or just keeping the property values as best they could.
Right. Absolutely. So here's what that court's opinion said in Oklahoma. It is well known generally that the purchase, rental, or leasing of real property by African Americans will always cause the remainder of the property in the same block to decrease in value at least from 50 to 75%. Yeah. So what you ended up having was somebody would then file a lawsuit, and then the neighbors would all come in and they would sue you. So one of the examples here was that in the case of a subdivision in Westlake, the first homes were sold in 1949 for about $10,000. By 1955, the typical price was about $15,000. And in this case, they had a covenant that specifically said that you would get damages of $2,000 to each of the 8 closest neighbors.
Wow.
if that was sold to somebody who violated that restrictive covenant. So then it moved on from, we're not going to let you live here, to, well, you can live here, but your 8 closest neighbors, you're going to pay $2,000.
You got to pay us.
So you got to pay more than what the home is worth to all the neighbors to provide damages for the fact that you're a black person living next to them, because it's diminishing their property value.
So almost making it unaffordable.
Yeah, I mean, I think at that point it becomes prohibitive. It's like, well, this house would cost you $15,000, but then you got to pay $16,000 in damages to your neighbors around you.
Right.
And that's right. Like, it's not realistic.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the kind of crazy stuff that you were seeing. And so, again, here we are, 2022, whatever year it is now, 2020 something.
2020 something.
Right. And so obviously all these things aren't, enforceable anymore, but I don't know. What's kind of your reaction to that, Nabil?
Not good. I mean, it's kind of like you can see people reacting a certain way because of everything that was happening. But there was another case. I think it was Brown v. Board of Education.
Yeah.
That was, and obviously I kind of lean to you for lawyery type of assessments and analysis, but that was talking about separate but equal is not actually equal, correct? With people going to school in like mixed races going to school together.
Yeah. Exactly. So, so Brown versus Board of, right. We had this whole civil rights movement going on, right? And so housing was just one piece of it, and education was the other. And there was this concept of separate but equal, right? That if we can have segregation, as long as the services that are provided are equal, it's okay to have them separate. And so the theory, I'm like air quoting here, definitely theory, was that you can have 2 schools, and as long as the education being provided was the same, then it's okay to have a black school and a white school. And it would be, again, many people have seen pictures of like, we've got a white water fountain and a black water fountain, and so that was what it became. It was like, well, they're separate and they're segregated, but it's okay because they're equal. Now, were they equal? Absolutely not, right? That was the reality, was that they weren't. So Brown versus Board of Education comes and says, in the education context, separate but equal does not exist, right? That's right. Not legal. That's not permissible. That's not true. We can't do that anymore. So we are going to integrate schools. And this was 1954, I believe. And so you had that same thing. You had states refusing to integrate because the Supreme Court can issue a ruling. This is one of the interesting things about the Supreme Court and why it can be so difficult, is that the Supreme Court has no real mechanism to enforce their orders. The reason Supreme Court orders are enforceable is because ultimately we all agree and we're going to follow them, and also that the other branches of the government will follow suit as well. So you've got the executive branch that's enforcing those laws. And that's what eventually happened in education, is calling out of the National Guard to force integration of schools. But you had, even into the 70s, you had in Alabama, the governor of Alabama standing on the steps of a school saying, we are not going to integrate, well, and even into the 70s. So while we had 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, 20 years later, we still weren't fully integrated in everywhere. But that was part of the whole civil rights movement, was we were looking at housing, we're looking at education, we're looking at public accommodations. And that's where we start to see the Civil Rights Acts getting enacted during that time period as well, which ultimately 1968, the Fair Housing Act was adopted, which finally provided for, you can't discriminate on the basis of race, ethnicity, all the 7 protected classes that we talk about.
Yeah. And I mean, I think those cases and the laws and the restrictions all kind of scaffolded onto each other. You have people saying, hey, you got to pay us a fine, and obviously you can't live there anymore. So then obviously you can't go to that school anymore because you don't live in that area. And so it was just, it was interesting, and it is interesting how still everything kind of works in conjunction together, and there's no, this is what went wrong.
Right. Right. And so, it's, again, there was so much to it because we saw at the local levels, city councils that were creating their own policies. You had zoning that was going on. You had restrictive covenants that were going on. It was sort of across the board, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was things were being attacked at every single level of government and in every different way that they possibly could. Obviously starting out specifically naming race, and then it became more subversive where we're not specifically naming any race or anything like that, but that was the effect of it.
Right.
And fortunately, like, we at least do have well settled law that can't exist today, but there's the repercussions and the consequences, right? These things don't change quickly. They don't change easily. And I think this is where it gets really complicated, is like the remedies, right? Like, how do you fix these issues? And the book has a chapter on some of the remedies, and some of them most of them, the author acknowledges are untenable. They're politically untenable. They would not work. You would never get agreement. So it proposes a number of possible remedies, many of them around incentivizing integration, basically, that we're going to look at neighborhoods and see how integrated they are. And in some way, shape, or form, we're going to create incentives to have more integration. And, the point that I think that he makes as he starts out here is that the nation is better when we're interacting with people of other races, of other backgrounds, when we understand cultural differences of other people. And I 100% agree with that. Like, how can we possibly have good policy? How can we possibly be a nation for all people if we don't know other people? And it is real easy to get siloed into your little community that are people around your same socioeconomic status, and in many cases your same race. I mean, that's where we've become, because housing is still so very segregated in many ways.
And that, also kind of what we've talked about, happens naturally sometimes, right? You gravitate towards restaurants that you might like in an area, or the supermarket has stuff that you want, and a book talks about that as well. And that's a slow process, and sometimes that's a barrier to be like, oh, well, I'm gonna have to travel 20 minutes to go X place, and sometimes you pick an area dependent on what's proximity.
Right. And so as we've then created this segregated housing where people stay near them, while it now becomes de facto segregation, right? Like, it's transformed into that, because while there may not be a policy that says, well, if you're African-American, you can't live in this neighborhood, that policy doesn't exist. There's technically not a restriction on that. So the de jure segregation is no longer there. It has become, because it has been so pervasive for so long, it was so integrated, that we've made it to where it's now just de facto very difficult for people to then integrate into, to where we do have more integration. We do have more just being around people that are different from us, right? And the author makes a point that that's important. And one of the things he does talk about is starting with education. And so while there are a lot of complex and he says complex and imprecise ways of fixing this, right? This is not easy. There's no like simple fix for anything, but he does make a point that I think is important, of beginning with education curriculum, of teaching what is factually true. And he pointed out, and I thought this was very interesting, and I'm trying to think back to like my middle school, high school time period. And so what he noted is a couple of the most popular history books that are used in middle school, high school education. And a 2012 edition of one of them, that this is what it had to say about residential segregation. African Americans found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's it. That's what it said. That's what the book has about it, is that they found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods. That's not a lot, right? When we're talking about, the history of just segregation in general, to say that they found themselves forced into segregated neighborhoods.
But like, why did that happen?
Yeah, doesn't give you a lot of context, and it does sort of support the idea that there was only de facto segregation and not necessarily de jure segregation. And when they talked about things like the FHA there was very much a lack of, there was no discussion of their literal enforcement of that. The only way you could get an FHA backed mortgage or build an FHA backed neighborhood was if it was only sold to people who are Caucasian or white.
Right.
And so we do have like an education problem where people then get to be our age and they just don't know. They didn't know the history of what that looks like. And so then we have people that are getting into the real estate industry, for example, and they don't know. They just never learned it. And that's not their fault.
Right.
It's just we didn't teach people that. And so, you know, I think that education is important. And so while a lot of the policies and remedies that he discusses, I mean, I agree with his premise that like realistically isn't going to happen because it just I mean, again, the mountains you have to move to try to get that kind of thing to happen is not realistic. And again, what is the best way to handle it? I mean, I don't know that there is such a thing as a best way or a great way, but yeah.
And one of the interesting distinctions that was addressed in the book was remedies versus reparations, where, you know, both are trying to achieve the same goal, but are reparations the correct way to go about it, or is like, okay, let's look at what we have and let's remedy the situation?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
You know, I think that.
And what do people there think about that?
Yeah, I think it's difficult because, you know, what would happen today, I think if you looked at what would happen and if you had a race-based reparations policy or a race-based remedy policy, right, you're going to have what's going to happen? Well, somebody's going to file a lawsuit and say, look, we can't make laws based on race because now we're discriminating against other races, right? So, and that would be, and I think that they're realistically, they would probably win that, right? Because we've seen things like, you know, race-based admission policies in colleges get attacked. And we've seen, I mean, all these various things. And so I think it's very, very challenging to come up with what kind of remedies would exist that are realistically possible to get adopted. And Jessica Thompson makes a point that one of the things, and it's talked about in the book as well, is that some of the things we see today are like minimum square foot requirements, lot size requirements, those kinds of things that again make it challenging for somebody who hasn't had multiple generations perhaps of the opportunity to buy housing to then take that, because what's the hardest house to buy? Your first one, right? Because what you get to do then is live in that house for a while, then take the equity as a down payment into the next one to buy a bigger house and upgrade and so forth. And so some of us, our families perhaps have had many, many, many years, decades of being able to have those opportunities where if you are not Caucasian or white, like your families were completely restricted from being able to do that. So even if you wanted to, and perhaps had the means. And so they looked at examples in the book where you could have maybe somebody who was, you know, a black doctor, for example, trying to move into a neighborhood that is absolutely the same socioeconomic status as, or same economic status at least as the white people in the neighborhood, but was prohibited from moving into it. So wasn't able to take advantage of those. And so I think it's challenging when you look at what could be done. I think it's challenging to figure out how that would work, that would be upheld, that would be able to be implemented. And that's why I don't have a good answer, right? We can talk about the problems, but what are the remedies? I don't know, right? I don't know what that is. Again, the book talks about a lot that the acknowledges probably aren't realistic to actually happen. And so that's sort of the difficult thing to look at.
I think the important, you were talking about education policies and things like affirmative action. One of the important things, whatever remedy comes about, is to look at it realistically, right? Because like affirmative action, sometimes it's portrayed as, hey, it's giving people a choice or an opportunity while not taking away from anyone. But in reality, if, you know, a spot goes to X, a spot goes away from Y, right? So there's always a give and take, and I think it's important to be realistic about what the give and the take would be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the challenge that everybody shows, because when you try to support one remedy, there's going to be somebody that's saying, but you're taking away their opportunity from somebody else. I think that's the difficulty of it, is that again, and again, people have so many different political beliefs and personal beliefs, and so that's what makes it certainly extraordinarily difficult to find remedies for them. But kind of as we're getting ready to wrap up here, we want to actually ask some of you guys, what was your biggest takeaway from the book? Like something that you grabbed onto that you found very interesting or profound, or just sort of an interesting takeaway. I mean, that maybe or something that you learned. I'd be interested in hearing from you guys kind of what some of your big takeaways were.
Yeah.
What about you, Nabil? What was something, just a point from the book that I think that maybe you found interesting or
saddening? Any
yeah,
point? Yeah.
I mean, I think that's, again, to me, it was very educational, right?
Yeah,
it was educational to learn so much more than what I did know. And I think that was helpful for me to just understand contextually. But yeah, what would be a big takeaway there?
I think my the point that stuck to me and has stuck with me is naturally integrated housing was being formed, but steps were taken to segregate that. And so you had thriving communities and thriving neighborhoods that were well integrated and living well and prospering. But those were kind of demolished, and segregated housing was created from that neighborhood or that area. And that was obviously that was the policy at that time, and that was the thing. But that's such a loss. That kind of like stuck with me a lot.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I found frustrating was, there were areas that were integrated, and some of this was early public housing, for example, where in learning what public housing was originally was very different than what my perception of it was. Right. I'm thinking, when I think of public housing, maybe I think of like the high-rise block on, in Chicago or whatever.
Right.
And that was very different from what the original concept of public housing was. But we had integrated housing that then like city councils and states went so far as not even just to leave the integrated places integrated, but they specifically went into then undo that integration. They went in to go in and desegregate those. So whatever progress had been done, just makes you that what would have happened if, right? Like what would have happened? Where would we be if we had allowed those communities that were integrated to continue to be integrated? There was no reason to do that, but yet we then went in and just rolled back the clock on it. It was like, we're not even going to just leave that neighborhood. And so new ones, I mean, it was not that would have been okay to just segregate the other ones that were new, but like the idea that we're going to also go in and desegregate what was already integrated, that wasn't, there was no reason besides that's what we wanted to do. And I think that was very kind of a frustrating takeaway for me. And Samuel makes a point here that, when you brought up reparations, that he says that it's only difficult to pass for descendants of American slavery, but we have seen other areas where people have been, received benefits from the government, 9/11 victims, Japanese internment victims, Holocaust victims, and so forth. And so, I think it's a point that there are other areas where we've seen these kinds of things done. And so where will we end up, and will that be a thing? We'll certainly interested to see. And what does Kathy say here?
Kathy says, de facto or de jure, in the 1950s, the Hispanic people lived 1 mile north of Winoka. My father was one of these people, and I wish I knew, and she never asked, she says, if this was by choice or for comfort level. He shared stories of not being allowed to eat in restaurants and could not get a haircut at a local barbershop.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's here in Oklahoma, relatively small town, and having to live outside of town, and like you said, wondering whether they made that choice in that case, whether they made that choice or that's where they were permitted to live, right? I have an uncle, and Black uncle, grew up in New Orleans, and certainly have heard a lot of stories like that as well from him and his family of growing up during the civil rights era in New Orleans there in the South. And so a lot of stories like that. And so I think for me, it would be encouraging to see people, as kind of Jessica talked about at the very beginning, of talk to your relatives and see what their perspective was, see, while you have that opportunity, because in this case, Kathy's saying never had the opportunity to ask that.
Yeah.
And so, I would certainly encourage that. So, again, like, while it feels like this was very, depressing and
doom and gloom.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the on the flip side is like, it's learning, right? And maybe that's where we're at right now. Like, maybe we don't have the answer right now. Maybe there's not the political ability to have a remedy, an answer right now, but to understand it is step one, right?
Mm-hmm.
To understand like the context, to really see what the picture was of all the details, I think is important. And so, that's certainly kind of where I'm at, is this education is important. I think that is important for us to be educated on just what the history is, right? That doesn't mean that, I don't know. I mean, it's important to me. I just think to kind of understand that history and to just know, I mean, it's what was the law, what was happening. And the more you get a bigger picture, and the more people understand that, then, for future generations, we can avoid new problems that we ran into in the past, and also maybe find ways that we can, fix issues that are still around by virtue of what happened in the past. So.
Right. Jessica Thompson's biggest takeaway was that there's work to be done, and 100%.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I mean, I think that there's a lot has been done, right? We've seen so much advancement in removing restrictions, creating enforcement mechanisms. We've seen things like the Realtor Association go from, being a big opponent to, equal housing and to now being much more of a proponent of it and doing more education. So like, shout out to Fairhaven.realtor, right? If you're a realtor and you haven't done that, like, it was a great learning opportunity. It's actually kind of fun. So go to Fairhaven.realtor and go through that, kind of fair housing education course. Is actually really kind of fun, interesting. And so we'll see more of those opportunities to do better, right? To do some of that work. And sometimes that's on an individual level of what can I do individually to do better myself, and to have discussions with colleagues and those kinds of things. So definitely check that out. That's one example of something that you can individually do today to at least do a better job of educating yourself on what is the law today, what are the things I can do and can't do, and what are some of these real life scenarios that we deal with today so that we can avoid problems. Nabil, do you have any closing thoughts?
My mind is blank right now, Jeff. No, no. Every time we like talk about this, and we've obviously talked about the book in the past, and we've chatted about it off and on. It just it puts me in a mode of what can I do? Like what can we do? Whether it's at a local level, at maybe your neighborhood level, like whatever level, like what is something that you can do or that I can do to not make the situation worse. I can't say that I can fix it, but I can definitely not make it worse.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. Another thing there, we'll put that up there too, is the At Home with Diversity course. This is something else as for realtors, and it'll give you the At Home with Diversity designation or certification. I don't know which one it is, but you can take that course, and it's also really good. I mean, I really enjoyed that when we did that. Did you get to do that one?
I haven't done that one yet.
It's a really good kind of course that you can do that I thought was very helpful and interesting as well.
That'll be interesting to do after reading this book.
To have more of that context for sure. And then Samuel says, again, he's happy to see these discussions held across cultural lines, that work is to be done as Americans, and we're the country we choose to be. And I think that's a fantastic point. And like you said, we've come a long ways, but there's still so far to go. We're not at a destination. We're not at an ending point. And then last thing here, what does Kathy say there?
Kathy says, we know the fair housing law in our hand. We need to get this care for everyone in our hearts. Well, I'm like reading really choppily.
Is that how you read the book?
Hey, you know what? I moved here when I was 16.
There you go. So as we close out here, again, thank you guys for joining us. We hope that either you read the book and joined along and found it educational and thought-provoking. It certainly did for us. We want to do this again, right? We want to have another Talking Real book club and keep this up and find interesting books. So it doesn't even have to be about fair housing or anything like that. It could be anything. It could be anything related to real estate. It could be anything related to business. What's a book that you think that other realtors should read? Something that maybe helped you in your business, something that just was thought-provoking to you that we could possibly do as a next time Talking Real book club. So check that out. Leave that in the comments, what you think the recommendations should be.
Or send us an email.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this not on video, podcast@okrealtors.com.
Absolutely. So again, thank you guys for engaging. We appreciate everybody that joined us live here, leaving your comments. Man, it was fun to do. We'll be doing more of these lives, I think, because this is always a good time for us to be able to have those discussions and put your questions up. It's kind of a fun thing, a little bit different. So again, thanks for joining us. We appreciate you guys every single episode here on Talking Real. This was episode 203. And until next time, we'll see you back here on Talking Real.